Hello, my name is Michael Souza. I came from the University of Coimbra, from the Department of Civil Engineering, and my relation to board games is that I use them as serious games for urban planning. I'm talking here about an experiment finding Ludemes in the top #1 games of Board Game Geek. Some researchers say that we are living in the golden age of board games. And for example, this graphic from Board Game Geek, which is one of the most famous websites about board games, especially modern board games. And we can see here the exponential growth of new releases from the 2000s and forward. The growth has been very considerable, and we can see here the impact of the COVID-19. This is growing and generating money. For example, it is expected that between 2020 and 2026, with a growth of 13% a year, although we know that the pandemic slowed down the board game companies in about 20%. We have data that say to us that in 2025, the industry of board games, at least in the United States, will be $5 billion. And you can see this graphic in the right, the volume of tabletop games at Kickstarter and video games, and we can see that the money collected by board games, it's bigger than video games in Kickstarter. But what are these modern board games? They can be narrative or abstract. They value player decision and interactions, can have luxurious game components or minimalists. They provide experiences for different player profiles. They can be played solo or multiplayer, and they can be massive or micro in the size, and they can be cheap or expensive. We can see, for example, here the case of Frosthaven in Kickstarter that collected almost $30 million. So this is very considerable. This, just to say, this is growing and this is important even from the economical point of view. The main article was to see here what games from the top of Board Game Geek from the start of the website in the 2000s. What are the characteristics of these games? If we can find some Ludemes. Since the beginning of BGG, the users can rate the game, can evaluate it, define the complexity and the duration, the age, a lot of characteristics. Here, these are the games that were in the #1, although there are some doubts about the years because there's no record data. I found a thread online that stated these games, but all these games are rated very high, and they were rated very high along the past 20 years. And we can see here 3 characteristics: the number of players, minimal number, the maximum number of players, the average duration in minutes, and the complexity. And we can see that the duration was reduced. The Pets of Glory was a very long game, and then the other names that achieved #1 were games that played a lot faster. But the level of complexity stayed higher, near 4, with a maximum of 5. The maximum number of players it increased. So these are games to be played multiplayer. It's usual that the games of the top now can be played by more than 2 players at the same time, usually 3, 4, with some exceptions reaching 5. And now, what is a Ludem? I think this is important. The definition from David Parlett is very important. It's a fundamental unit that often equivalent to a rule of play, conceptual equivalent of a material component of a game. So this gives us some clues that we should find, for example, rules, game components, mechanisms. And the question is, can we find some patterns in these games that were the #1s at Board Game Geek? I focus on these #1s because they are games that were played by many players and that are loved by many players. So are there anything common in them? That's what I'm trying to find, and I'm trying to propose some patterns and then trying to find some eventual Ludemes. I've stated some of these characteristics of the selected games, and we can see here the reduction of the duration of the game and the levels of complexity that are very similar, near 4, between 3 and 4. The type of games changed also, but we have a sample here of Euro games and war games and recently thematic games. but there's a tendency to games with less conflict. And most of these games were about war or historical themes. From the general physical system, they all represent the world at some scale, from regional to the world. The units, they can be squares, a grid of squares, hexagons, and point-to-point movement. And point-to-point movement can be kind of an abstraction of some paths in the grid. They usually use tiles and some bits. Here bits are cubes and pawns, and they usually associate colors to the players: yellow, green, blue, red. And players in these games, they mostly handle tiles of cards. It's the dominant representation. Here I focus on the mechanisms of the games. We can see a lot of games with tile placement, few with dice rolling, which is interesting because these modern board games usually tend to be less random, and the random effects usually are parts of the simulation, for example, war outcomes. The new games tend to have player asymmetry, which is also interesting to define different roles and experiences for the players. We can see here that the random impacts and random outcomes are decreasing. We can see here some examples of tiles, because most of the games have tiles, and the tiles are used to represent different things. You can see here in Paths of Glory, the tiles represent armies. In Puerto Rico and Agricola, they represent plantations and rooms and buildings. And for example, in Twilight Struggle and Tigers and Euphrates, and in Gloomhaven, they represent enemies or our character or something that we are controlling in the space, in the game environment. For example, there's a lot of diversity in the tiles with graphical information, text information, numbers, iconography. Iconography, it's important to reduce the quantity of text needed, and they allow the tiles to be smaller, for example, important in Paths of Glory. Some have illustrations to create the narrative and to introduce to the theme. We can see this in the recent versions of Puerto Rico, that the original tiles were only with text, and now they have illustrations. And they usually, these tiles and the components are combined with other components like cards and bits. And you can see also examples in Gloomhaven of standard tiles, where the tiles are put in the base and they represent a character, an enemy, and we can try to see what are the core mechanisms that the players activate in these games. And we see the dominance of the tiles effects. The tiles usually affect other tiles, affect the cards, affect the bits, the cubes, the pawns. But if we want to address all the whole system, we can see that all is connected to all, and this is difficult to analyze. This is why we usually stay and analyze the core mechanisms. I found a pattern here that most of these games is about progression in the board. Progression as a movement, or progression as growth, as accumulation. You can see here examples of Tigers and Euphrates, Puerto Rico and Agricola, where the progression is for adjacent tiles in a squared grid, that they represent the area that is controlled, for example, the growth of a plantation or the growth of a house, something like that, or a kingdom, like in Tigers and Euphrates. And for example, in the other games, like Paths of Glory and Gloomhaven and Pandemic Legacy, we can see here the point-to-point movement that can be done in a grid or in the symmetrical grid, for example, with hexagons in Gloomhaven, or with a symmetric grid in Pandemic, in Paths of Glory, where the progression is the movement of the bits and the tiles in the wall, represented by the point-to-point movement. So these are some of the patterns that are found. And this is some kind of graphical representation. For example, when they try to simulate growth and accumulation, we can see that the tiles are put adjacency to what exists, and they can be put in the same space representing accumulation, or they can represent growth in the asymmetric network with a path. But the movement also can be represented in this kind of grids. So the tiles disappear and appear next to the previous space that they occupied. And this can be done in symmetric or asymmetric grids. So discussing the findings, it was difficult to express the patterns because the games were very different. Aiming for the mechanisms and the associated metaphors helped. For example, grids, networks, tile placement, pattern movement, and the adjacency effects appeared as something common in all the games, regardless of what they were trying to accomplish, what's the theme of the game. Some general tendencies. The complexity levels are medium or high in these top games, reduced the effect of randomness, so the player agency, the choices, and they tended to be asymmetric and with higher complexity levels. The duration of the games tended to be reduced as the new games were released. The new games achieved the number one. Some tendencies of the mechanical side. Progression. There's a tendency for progression, building up by adding pieces or moving pieces further along, reducing the conflict and increasing player collaboration. Some of the last games, for example, Pandemic Legacy and Gloomhaven, they are collaborative games where the players collaborate. So there's a tendency to avoid player elimination and interconnected game mechanisms, cards, tiles, and bits all connected to create a game system. There's a tendency for having grids, symmetric or not, with squares, hexagons, or point-to-point movement. Some physical tendencies, set of player pieces where each player has its color, increasing the effect of graphical art and miniatures. The new games tend to have more detailed art and more detailed miniatures. The tiles and the cards usually bring some additional information beyond texts or iconography. Many of them are illustrated, and all the games represent the world and the game environment in some way. For example, representing part of the world or region, a city, something like that. They defined the world's boundaries. They are not modular, which is curious. And the recent games have a tendency to have legacy dimensions. So legacy is when the players play the games in several play sessions, and they change the game in each session. For example, ripping cards, adding cards, writing in the boards, changing the game, which is something that is very popular at the moment. About the narratives, the themes are the adult themes about economy, story, war. We have an exception, that is Gloomhaven, that is fantasy. The tendency for detailed miniatures made for the game, and the legacy that I've also talked about. And there's also a tendency to give each player an avatar. Some general conclusions. Mechanical side, grids and networks to create constraint and progression, growing effects along the game space, growth and concentrations with a combination of the bits, the tiles in the grids and the paths in the networks, the narrative metaphors, growth and developing, and this leads to occupy the space. This is why they are connected to growth, and moving and progressing, exploring the space. It's also a tendency. The art in the pieces materialize the world over the grids and networks. So there's a mathematical system and the geographic and geometric system that is filled with narrative and theme. Some possible conclusions and research paths. Games that foster socialization. This is a tendency, and I believe this can be explored. These games foster player agency, the impact of reducing the randomness of the game. Games about building up, unlock things and progressing, and the increasing impact of art and physical components. The combination of the mechanisms create new interactions and complex game systems. And 3 players appear to be the standard player count for the most common games, associating players with different colors. So this is some of the possible conclusions, and I think we can use these statements to produce more research about these new games and why board games, what we call modern board games, are being so popular and are successful and growing even when we are dominated by digital technology. I don't know if I achieved the purpose of identifying some of the Ludem, because the concept is not that defined. And in these kind of games with a lot of complexity, with a lot of mechanisms, with a lot of components and bits, this is even harder. But I think I identified some of the patterns that can be seen as Ludems. For example, the way the bits and the tiles occupy the space of the game space, and how they progress and they move around the board. There's a tendency for progression and accumulation in these games. Most of them goes beyond zero-sum games, with the exception of Twilight Struggle. It's one of the biggest examples of a zero-sum game in these examples, but most of them it's about accumulation, about progression, and about efficiency, relate to Euro games as a type of game. And these new games, these last two, Pandemic Legacy and Gloomhaven, they are kind of an hybrid between what we call the Ameritrash and American games and Euro games, but because they result from the mixing of these systems of accumulation and reduced player interactivity of the Euro games, and the thematic implementations and some of the randomness that the system provides the players to challenge them and to bring them novelty and uncertainty that American games had, and they are now combined in these new forms of legacy games. So I think we can say that the Ludemes here are the progression, the ways the games deal and use tiles to fill the game space, and this tendency for the reduction of the conflict between the players and the indirect conflict and collaboration also. Thanks for the attention. Thanks for your time. You can contact me here. And I have a YouTube channel in Portuguese if you ever want to visit it. Thank you.